breaks, but as a way to maintain a state of order that the ruling class is essentially admitting that it has no end game for, it has no way out of. So we're constantly told to return to these same measures, these same moments. And I think, without overstating the case, this really is the picture of an order in crisis, right? And I think one of the ways that we see that is in the discourse of the far right today. So if we turn back the clock, go back to the 1980s, or even go back, to the 1940s, and see who fascists were most concerned with, it was rarely with the state. Sometimes it was, but it was often directed at the left, right? So fascists in the 40s, they were anti-communist before they were anything else, right? They identified communism as their enemy. They identified whole other groups as their enemies, obviously, as well. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But it's telling today that if we look at the modern discourse of the alt-right and other far-right actors, they talk endlessly about cultural Marxism. It's kind of like this abstract boogeyman, right? But they don't identify those measures, those movements, those impulses to build a better world collectively as really their opponents. And I think that speaks to the failure of our movements to actually build that strength and that resilience and to continue that struggle effectively. So in many ways, I think our best solution to creating anti-authoritarian solutions to this current crisis, to this pandemic, lie in understanding how we can build those relationships and those organizations back up at the level of workplace, community, whatever public space we may still inhabit in the midst of all of this, and also to the fact that we need to do that as urgently as possible in order to build our capacity to actually sustain ourselves in the face of a state that's clearly demonstrating its willingness to let us fall by the wayside. But I'd be curious to hear also from you. I'm not here to offer any great solutions. Obviously, I think this is a moment of incredible tension and struggle. And there's a lot going on here, including a federal election, which is leading to some interesting possibilities and some kind of terrifying ones, I guess, but no more terrifying than usual. But what do you think? I mean, you've seen this, you've lived through this. I'm telling you nothing new about the shape and state of the pandemic here. What anti-authoritarian strategies or struggles have you seen in recent weeks, months, that are inspiring to you, especially local ones? Are there any that stick out to you?
Anything to say about the freedom rallies?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about them if you want to.
I mean, it's just what came to mind right now.
Yeah, the so-called freedom rallies. Yeah.
My major concern is that the vast majority of people spearheading these anti-lockdown measures are the far right. Just from the context of what I see in Quebec, there's groups like La Meute who are organizing anti-immigrant, Islamophobic rallies who are now at the forefront of this. So that there's also Rebel Media organized one in Montreal, anti-lockdown. So you have this weird kind of trifecta of nationalist, populist, far-right groups alongside these kind of alternate health hippies, as well as Christian evangelicals. So you're having a discourse of the far right being propagated into a larger base of people who might not normally align with those. And I don't want to be involved in a three-way fight. I'm not going to go to an anti-masker rally and take on Maxime Bernier and crew, right? I just don't know what possible solution to shut that down would be.
I think that was so well said too. It's like in some ways that's the crux of the problem for me too right now is looking at the way, and I mean even for those of you who've been paying attention to mainstream media, the way that whether they were calling them freedom rallies, whether we're calling them and way back in the spring of last year when this stuff was happening in the States too, and you had these giant anti-lockdown protests in places like Michigan. While I held no love in my heart for the organizations that were behind them or their obvious affiliation with the far right, I thought there was a very telling kind of dismissive bougie liberalism around the take that we were offered in the mainstream media, right? Which suggests that these people are simply flat earthers, fools, COVID deniers, and I mean many of them are, right? Like, I mean that's not even inaccurate. That describes a segment of them, but this opportunity that obviously anarchists have made such a point of advancing over decades and centuries is that the state is not our friend, right? And that we don't need to give our freedom up to the state in order to be secure and in order to be free. And it is, I think, it's super disheartening to see the far right sees that totally cynically, of course, with no sincere interest in actually building relations of collective liberation amongst people, but turning that very cynically and seeing the kind of traction they're getting with that. I think it does speak to something, and again, it speaks to a moment that I'm not saying our movements are not engaged in at all, but I see as something that has been less prominent from the left, right? Like where is the persuasive discourse around what we could do differently, how we might live in this moment that would bend some of those people, especially the non-ideologically convinced, to a struggle of collective freedom rather than blaming George Soros or Jews or brown people or the Chinese writ large or whomever the big enemy is right now for their problems and their ills, and indeed prolonging the suffering of people because you're spreading a potentially deadly disease as well. And I think this is it's a tactical question, it's a strategic question as well. It's not just kind of it's not just an abstract problem, right? And it's made manifest again by these recent rallies everywhere that we're seeing now, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, that are drawing significant crowds of people in a moment where the hounding of politicians across the campaign trail, which I don't bemoan. Let them be hounded, but let them be hounded for the right reasons. And seeing the incredible traction this is gaining, especially amongst segments of society who have been traditionally spared the worst cutting edges of this oppressive and exploitative system, right? In Vancouver, we saw lots of signs equating vaccines with the Holocaust, with mask wearing with slavery, public health orders with genocide. It seems beyond tone deaf. It seems like a completely anxiety-ridden response to the crisis of the prevailing order that will be resolved in favor of an even more authoritarian order if our movements aren't prepared to step into that breach and do something different, right? And take advantage of that and build that kind of capacity from the ground up. Any other thoughts, ideas, examples?
One sort of question I have for you is I feel like we've talked about a lot of different disaster situations which our movements are good at organizing around because they're about rapid, collective decision-making to help each other collectively. Pulling people out of buildings, collective effort that can be logistically done easily, setting up mutual aid during Katrina. Not easy, but can be done. COVID gives us a unique situation to deal with tactically and strategically, where our decision-making processes can't happen because we can't, and our practice also can't happen because we cannot be close to each other at certain times. Not just for legal reasons, but actually for health reasons. So I don't know, the right can organize around that because they don't care about each other, right? They are motivated by their own personal fear. They're leaning into their own personal alienation. But how do we do collective organizing that alleviates the crisis, continues to put pressure on the state to be better, to give us more freedom, in a way which we can actually still care for each other and be healthy?
Yeah, thanks, Art. That's again, that's so eloquently put. I think that's the crisis in a nutshell in some ways. And I wish I had a ready answer for it. It's certainly something that's been on my mind a lot lately, especially as somebody who studies the far right now and in its historical formation. I do think there's something that we take for granted, the fact that it's our movements for collective liberation that have been foremost concerned with the fate and state of people's day-to-day lives. But I think that it kind of dismisses the fact that the far right has always been good, if not at really caring about those things and speaking the language of concern and speaking a kind of like everyday language that reaches out to people in those moments and creates easy scapegoats, for sure, right? It's not capitalism to blame. It's Vietnamese fisherfolk. It's not a military-industrial complex run amok. It's a shadowy cabal of Zionists and deep state activists. It's not the ruling class. It's a satanic, globalized pedophile cult. And I think I'll be honest, I think this is in many ways like what I see as a central struggle is what has been deeply disheartening is to see how persuasive those like patently shitty conspiracy theories have been at mobilizing people. When I first heard about QAnon a couple of years ago, I totally thought it was I'm like, this is a joke. This is like we're just going to be laughing in a week, right? And instead it was a genuine movement that shaped one of the elections of one of the world's superpowers in dramatic and deeply disturbing ways. So I think to begin with, I think to be totally simplistic, the answer is in some ways in your question, right? It's points at exactly at those daily spaces that we continue to occupy and inhabit, whether we want to or not, as vital sites for the building of that collective power, right? So as a parent who has kids in school right now, like that's one space that I feel like, as limited as a space where you have traction, interest, and investment, where you're brought together with other people who are concerned about the kids, the state of education, and also like the workers in the classrooms, where some degree of connection and collaboration is both necessitated and desired in those spaces as we try to keep each other safe. And it's a weird way of breaking past some of the old, like where people might have used to treated you as strange if you wanted to have a political conversation with them in the schoolyard. Now these kinds of conversations have become regular. I mean, not political ones necessarily, but about how the school is running, about the public health measures, about these things that are really about the way we relate to each other, the institutions that govern us or try to control us and the rest of the world. And I think like maybe it's a bit easy to say, but I think that's fruitful and important. I think there remains space to push, especially at the level of municipalities and provinces in our context, for public health measures that at least address some of these urgent crises. So I don't know, like is there a possibility in pushing for the things that have been left so long, like less sick buildings, right? Better ventilated schools or hospitals. These sorts of and it sounds like tepid and totally reformist, right? And people are understandably disgusted if you kind of bring these things up in this moment of like overarching crisis. But on the other hand, I think in many ways, like this is the criticism of the scenester approach to activism that characterizes, I'm not going to say all of Turtle Island certainly, but that has been a part of our scenes and our movements for too long, where we talk to each other, we talk to folks who are already convinced, we escaped from the world that we found anti-human and exploitative and oppressive into spaces that felt good, but ultimately weren't reaching people unlike us. And I think this is a reminder that we it's necessary for us to do that work of reaching out to people who are not already convinced. That is the thing that the far right is mobilizing, and unfortunately, I remember it's funny. I was called by somebody in the media in December because this journalist was following a couple of channels on Telegram that had like 50,000 subscribers dedicated to propagating coronavirus conspiracy theories and mixed with a good dollop of white supremacy and racism. And his question to me at the time was, is this a potentially explosive combination? Like we have kind of the far and militarized right, not just kind of like run-of-the-mill Republican racists, but Atomwaffen types who are online and trying to make the connection between their struggles and a violent response to the state and to scapegoats and anti-vaxxers, like this work to bridge those two camps. And at the time, I was pretty convinced that it was a potentially explosive combination, and he seemed less convinced. And I think we're seeing it now. I mean, we haven't seen it yet. These communities need to be more fully mobilized and integrated into those structures for them to become truly dangerous. But the ability to propagate these ideas has become extremely powerful, and we don't seem to have like a platform that does that in an equivalent way, which is distressing when so many movements on our side are talking about care and liberation and solidarity, and you would think that would appeal to people in a moment where they don't feel they have any of those things. And yet, of course, like again, it speaks to the dominance of these kinds of myths at a cultural level that we're fed constantly, that it's the ruling class that keeps us safe from each other, that the world is at war all the time, you don't know it, and you have to be implicated in that one way or another. You have to choose a side, that through militarism and through punishment and repression is the way that we keep each other in line and safe. And in so many of the public health orders we've seen, again, we've seen that repeated time and time again, that other people are your enemy. And researchers who are totally non-ideological about this have commented on the fact that enduring crises like a pandemic actually wear down people's capacity to experience empathy. And, a 24/7 news cycle delivered through, a multitude of media channels absolutely contributes to that. So in many ways, I think what we come back to is this importance of, what we're doing here today. I mean, and again, I don't mean to sound trite about it, but coming back together, telling our stories of resistance, rebellion, and alternative building, talking about the fact that people are actually really good at working together to solve those kinds of crises that you mentioned, Art, right? That we were talking about, those short-term ones, and that basically innovating our way out of this one will require that kind of effort over the long haul in a way that we can only see in communities of really grounded resistance. I remember back when I was still doing my work with the Zapatistas, I had this wonderful opportunity to talk with an activist and organizer in the States by the name of Patrick Rainsborough, who worked for an organization called the Smart Meme Collective. And he said to me, I was asking him, I'm like, what's the difference? What's the difference between movements? So many of the movements in the North that felt at the time, especially movements that were not made up of indigenous folks, but were made up of settlers or whatever. What's the difference between these movements and movements like the Zapatistas, which seem so grounded and so like deep-rooted? And he said for him, that was the distinction. He's like, in places like Chiapas and in rebel territory, you have communities of resistance and in resistance. They're multi-generational. You go into them and it's not some spectacle of resistance. It's the daily work of like raising kids and running the clinic and like getting coffee to market and producing textiles, but doing it in a way that builds new kinds of relations as you're doing them, right? And we know, I mean, there are tons of examples. The water protectors here are an amazing example. Obviously, the work of Halifax Mutual Aid in recent months, right? Doing the incredible work of keeping people safe, of housing people, of meeting that need, and then standing up to state repression. Such good examples. But his point was that too many of us still constitute in the North defectors from the system rather than members of intentionally constituted communities that are building something else. And I'm not blaming us for that. I think this is the situation we are in, this context we find ourselves in. But I do think, like, for us to move past this and into a better world that's actually livable, that is the struggle, right? And the right understands that. Like, it's abhorrent to me for sure, but when they talk about a white ethno-state, what are they talking about? They're talking about community. They're talking about like a white homeland, right? As frightening and nonsensical as that is on dispossessed indigenous territory, in Turtle Island, they're talking about the idea of what they want as a place they can belong and be together. And they are speaking to other people who feel disaffected by the system that we live in ways that are powerful and persuasive to them, telling them a story that, again, blames people further down that ladder who are even more oppressed and more exploited than they are, and naming them as perpetrators. Well, we can surely, I think we're better than them at that, right? We have like a way longer history and a way better analysis of what's going on, you know? Like what amazes me is that anybody believes the nonsense ideas they peddle about who's to blame and what's at the root of this. It's like they're patently absurd, right? It's not, to call it like a story in a children's cartoon would be to do an injustice to children or to cartoon makers. So I think, you know, we need to seriously double down on that and speak in the same tones, but in a totally different way about that prevailing sense of alienation and living a less than human life that the right now is picking up on and speaking to really abundantly. And we need to show them the examples of how living a life that doesn't look like this can be more liberated, more satisfying, more resilient, and more democratic and just, and not speaking a language of apocalypse, catastrophe, dystopia, and the coming collapse, but rather seeing that, you know, the birth of something new. So, I mean, again, that's hardly a satisfying answer, but I think like in those directions lie our sense of possibility right now.
The right doesn't demand perfection from people. It allows people to be whatever flawed person that they came in with, as long as they're there for whatever the particular thing is. And on the left, we really fail in that. We're really intimidating to people. I just started, I guess, a year ago now. I joined Acorn, which is a more like popular, broad organization. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me, like, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to dress. I don't know how to approach these groups to not be rejected by them. So we need to kind of stop acting like a high school clique. And I don't think it's anybody's intention, but it alienates the average person in this community from being part of anything we actually need them to be a part of. It won't happen without everybody. And we left a lot of people on the table for the right to scoop up, especially in the last 13 years. And that's a failing.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I will say that a few years back, I was part of a little project here in the city that, you know, maybe you folks heard of. It was the Radical Imagination Project. We did lots of interviews with lots of activists. So this is not, you know, anything that comes from me, but it came from community of, you know, people who had done the work at that level, you know, on a day-to-day basis. Some of whom been activists for a long time, some of whom were fairly new to it. And, you know, we did dozens and dozens of interviews. And that was one of the most common refrains, actually, just how hyper-judgmental, exclusionary, denunciatory activists tend to find their own spaces. And I think, you know, again, without, I don't find this space to be like that. There's so many social justice spaces I've found myself in that I haven't found to be like that. But I think when enough people are saying that, I think that does bear listening to, right? So the right's not sincere about it. They hate the people often they're trying to recruit. As somebody who, you know, hides on all kinds of nasty Telegram channels these days, monitoring the far right, like what surprises me is that, you know, people just don't do that and see the way they talk about so-called normies all the time, right? They have nothing but contempt for these people, but they're entirely willing to reach out to them on their terms and mobilize them in pursuit of their own cause. And I don't think we should do that. I mean, I'm certainly not suggesting that should be our strategy, nor do I think that that's what was just mentioned. But I do think it's cause for reflection. Say, well, you know, if that's persuasive, then why haven't we been as persuasive? And it's not to say we haven't been, or we haven't won incredible victories, right? That our movements haven't won incredible victories. But I also think, you know, we're at a moment where it's important not to sort of rest on our laurels and convince ourselves that the scenes and spaces we've built and the spectacles that we've engaged in recent times haven't been enough and have not proven to be enough in the context of this pandemic-generated crisis. that we need to do more. We need to be, I think, more kind of ordinary about it and more committed at an everyday level. And we need to get serious, I think, about the idea of constructing alternatives that are durable in the face of a state that has proved to be remarkably prone to crisis and crumbling in a way that I think a lot of us thought it wouldn't be. I mean, I don't think it's on the verge of it, don't get me wrong, but there are moments where it's come pretty close. And if you look at what's going on in Europe right now and the Italian response to the proposed mandatory vaccinations, the right there is whipping up incredible public fear around that issue and mobilizing people in great numbers. And I think if we don't see that as a point of intervention, I think we are missing out, on a really vital struggle that we will regret. So that's all the time that I want to take from you folks, but I would love it if anybody wants to make a concluding comment or ask a question or give us an incredibly potent dose of inspiration in these undoubtedly dark and challenging times, then you'd be welcome to right now. But if people are feeling like they need to get up and move around and chat, yeah, Nika.
Yeah, so my question is around this moment right now. I'm noticing a lot of workplaces are asking for personal health information. And it's feeling very, very violating for me. And all of the stigma around vaccines is feeling really hard at this moment. And looking at who also feels more comfortable taking vaccines and who doesn't, and all of the oppression components of that. So I'm just really curious to hear your analysis of the moment and how the state is utilizing this moment to bring our health information into the workplace.
I think that's a great and super important question. I've just been given the note from one of the organizers that we do have another workshop, obviously, that you folks are probably very excited about too, and we do need to move things along. But I want to take the chance and maybe just finish on this note and thank you all for being here today. I think this is a super important question. As somebody who's been doubly vaccinated, I think it's important. I could do it. I do believe in the prophylactic effects of vaccination and endorse it. But I also think your question reminds me, or this issue reminds me a lot of the way the state ran kind of whole hog into criminalizing HIV status, right? And so we have a history where we don't even need to look around to see this, how the state is happy to weaponize certain kinds of health statuses, especially when they are held by populations deemed to be less than desirable. So I have to say, as a committed anti-authoritarian, as somebody who doesn't believe that coercion is going to result in our society being a better place, I don't think that that these measures, whether it's mandatory vaccination or to some extent the vaccine passport idea, I mean they're just end runs around the work that we actually need to do. The work that our entire society needs to do to build different sets of relations. Like, the reason the right has so much traction is because we live in this incredibly alienated society. That's not of our own making. We're not, nobody here is a capitalist. Like, we're not huge owners of productive potential and property. We're not mobilizing people that way. That's in their interest. We're left to deal with the fallout from it, of course. And I think these debates around, who should be allowed where and what kind of measures are required to prove your participation in certain kinds of venues wouldn't be an issue if we actually lived in a world, like if your school, let's take the school example again, had sufficient ventilation and classes of like 15 kids to a teacher, rather than cramming 35 kids into a classroom with one teacher for 8 hours a day in a building that was built 50 years ago, would we really require Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca to see us out of this? Like, I think that this is without suggesting, I mean, you should all, like, if you can, you should all get vaccinated. That's my, if you can, it's, like there's evidence to suggest it's going to keep you safe. And like, all we have to do is look at some of the jurisdictions where it's not happening. I was reading an article about Ohio today. Again, they're expecting 30,000 infections a week in a couple of weeks. 30,000 infections. They are moving towards triage protocols in their hospitals where they're literally deciding which 20-year-old is going to live and die, because that's who's filling up the ICUs now. It's not just people with pre-existing conditions or the elderly. It is like people who were unaffected in previous waves. So I mean, you got to take that seriously, I think. But do I think that empowering our bosses, empowering the state to surveil us and then further criminalize us if we don't fulfill their mandates, which have proven ineffective at any, hey, I thought this was a light at the end of the tunnel, right? We were all told it's going to be the hot back summer, that we're going to get out of it, we'll all be partying again. And
2 weeks to flatten the curve.
Yeah, right, exactly. Endlessly planking the curve, right? Endlessly planking the curve with our yes, by staying away from each other and by staying home as if we could magically do so. So I think like you're asking a super important question. I would definitely say, and I know unions are interested in this question, certainly if you're in a workplace where you're unionized, it should be like a big issue you're talking to your union about. But I do think, I could say, what we're seeing now is we are on the precipice of something very serious. And I think, again, the 5,000 folks who are on the streets in Vancouver the other day, the Italian response, and what we're seeing across Europe in terms of the pushback right now, there is the strong capacity for the far right to really weaponize that not illegitimate sense of being surveilled and policed and controlled, and as a response to getting out of this, that is not ever going to result in a more liberated society. So I mean, it's like the old blessing and curse, living in interesting, there's so much going on right now. There's lots of opportunity, right? We have a moment, right? In crisis, there is that opportunity for us as well. But it's a difficult struggle. So I thank you all for being here today and for taking part in this. Thanks. It's great to see so many folks out of the book fair on a day like this, and in a moment like this, coming together, thinking together, strategizing, practicing, being ungovernable. And we got to continue to do that and just convince more people to do that with us. And hey, I always like to finish on my utopia. It's all about autonomous federated communities, people. We all know that. Anyway, thanks.